Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we're going to begin a project that I've been thinking about for years. It's a Queen Anne bonnet-topped highboy. Leigh and Leslie Keno showed me a beautiful antique at Leigh's Gallery in New York. We'll go there first, then we'll come back here and start building our own Queen Anne bonnet-topped highboy. Well, I can't thank you guys enough for showing me the world of early highboys, and it appears I've come to the right place.
Thanks. Well, Norm, we do have a few highboys here. This is actually a linen press, or a clothes press from the 18th century, and this was made in Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, how do you know that?
Well, you see this block front facade here in the lower section? That's like signature Boston, 18th century.
Oh, so this is actually one thick piece of wood
That's
that
right.
this is carved out of?
Carved from the solid. Took a lot of work.
Wow.
And these tiers would draw the eye up visually here to these double tombstone doors, these panel doors.
So this sort of looks like a tombstone would look.
Exactly. Now you open up these doors and look at the sun is rising here.
Wow.
The beautiful sunburst, signature Boston, early Boston, pre-1750.
It's beautiful. Look at all this inlay work. Oh, you don't expect me to build something like this.
Well, you know, we know you can do it, but you want
do
something a little more simple?
A little simpler,
Okay,
yeah.
come over here. Now, this is a high chest, probably 1770s, coastal Massachusetts, made of walnut, and has a nice carved fan here, a dished out fan type motif, but it's plain,
Yeah,
okay?
no rays.
No rays really. Down here on the skirt, it is shaped a little bit. The legs are not real curvy, but it's okay. You know, it's a nice Queen Anne piece.
Yeah, it is a nice piece, but maybe something between these two.
In between,
a
you think
little
this is too simple?
fancier,
Okay.
A little carving.
Well, we've got a Connecticut River Valley one here. Yeah, made of cherry wood. How's that? What do you think of that?
Wow, that is a beautiful piece.
That's this was made in Wethersfield, Connecticut.
Well, how do you know that?
Well, probably in the 1770s or 1780s. And one characteristic of these shops was this motif, and it's called what's it called? A filfat? Yeah, that's right. It's a filfat. And actually, you know, we have to remember, in the 18th century, we didn't have electricity, of course.
Right.
We had candlelight. So this would actually add a bit of fantasy and movement to the room. And it was, if you look at this candle, think of the room filled with candles and the lights flickering. It would look like it's spinning.
Huh.
And it would have impressed the neighbors, you know. That's right. You know, your neighbor comes over and sees this piece with this, it's carved, it's vertical, it has nice brasses. This was an impressive piece.
Special
right?
piece that not everyone would have.
That's right. Exactly. And actually, most highboys we see, Norm, don't have very good proportions. I mean, there's some are a little top heavy. Yeah. This guy got it right. If you look at these proportions, these long, elegant, graceful legs, and this S-shaped line forms a rhythm across the skirt, classic Connecticut Wethersfield skirt. Yep. And really the balance is wonderful between the legs and the rest of the case. Yep. Draws our eye up. Look at these double bonnet moldings, S-shaped. Aren't they beautiful?
Yeah, there's a lot of vertical movement to it, not so flat in most of them.
Yeah, it's not compressed, yeah.
And how about these finials?
Well, you know, most of these finials from these pieces, these Wethersfield pieces, are gone. They're long gone and they get replaced. These are actually original. This really simple cigar shape is typical of what you see there in Wethersfield. So that's a nice thing to have.
You know, I'm always interested when I see a piece like this, especially when it's built in New England. You know, what kind of shop produced it, how many men did it take, and how long did it take? Well,
I'll tell you, Dr. Thomas Kugelman and his colleagues are writing a book on Connecticut furniture. They've studied this whole group of pieces from Wethersfield and all these areas. They found that a piece like this was probably made in one of the biggest shops in the Hartford area, Wethersfield area. Probably 5 people, a master, probably a couple of apprentices, yeah, a couple of journeymen. Would have taken probably 3 weeks or so. And would have cost probably £5 or so, which during the day it would have been one of the more expensive pieces in the house.
So this was a real special piece. I can see why. Yeah. And you're right, I love the proportions, but you know, it's going to take a couple programs for me to build a piece like this. I can't do this in one show. Would you guys have some time to come up to the workshop and give me a hand?
Sure, absolutely. As long as you make us a pot of coffee.
We got plenty of coffee.
Okay, all right. Okay. All right. That's good. Like
Thanks
regular,
a lot.
2 sugars, you know, cream. Right.
We'll fix it up for you. Well, as you might expect, I got absolutely no help from the Keno brothers. Those were just empty promises. So I was left here all alone in the shop to build our version of that Wethersfield, Connecticut highboy. But I'm glad I did. This is the most challenging project I've built to date, and it takes a lot of time, days in fact, and a certain amount of skill. If you'd like to try your hand at building your own Highboy, we'll have a measured drawing with all the details, and we'll include the sources for where we got this nicely featured tiger maple, these beautiful authentic antique brasses, as well as these Queen Anne legs. Now let's talk about the legs for a minute. We felt that we didn't have the time to make the legs ourselves, so we turned to our friend in Vermont who sells pre-made legs through catalog or on the internet. He happened to have a Highboy leg in tiger maple, but it wasn't quite right, so I made some modifications. I cut off this over the apron knee block because I wanted an under the apron block, and the height of this post wasn't quite right, so I modified the curve of the knee to give me more height here. Let me show you how I did that. That takes care of that. Now here's a pattern I've made of the new knee shape, and I'll just trace the outline. Now I can get some of this by hand. Now we can use the bandsaw to complete removing the material. I've set it in this cradle so that it's up and it'll be flat. Now before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. The back legs receive 3 mortises on each side to receive the panels. Okay, that takes care of the mortises in the front legs. There are 3 mortises on one side, a long mortise for the apron, and a tiny one for the top rail on the front. Look again at the base. The sides are glued up panels made out of tiger maple. There's a board that runs from here to here and a smaller piece on the top. I need to form tenons on each end to go into those mortises of the legs. The sides are the maple, the back is poplar, a secondary wood. Now to start forming the tenons, I've set up my stacked dado and the sacrificial fence. I'm going to run each piece through twice, forming a long tenon on each end. On the front of the base, there's an apron and a small top rail that requires tenons to fit into the legs. I'll use the same setup, except I remove the sacrificial fence, put a stop block down, and I'll use my miter gauge to form those tenons. Now I'm ready to form the 3 individual tenons on each panel. So I've attached a large backer board to my miter gauge with some screws. Then I ran it through the dado head once to give me the exact location of the cut and transferred lines up to the top of the backer. Now I can use those lines as references to remove the material to form the individual tenons. Now a little hand work with a sharp chisel removes the rest of the material between the tenons. Now that dado, which goes at the top edge of each of the panels, will support a frame which will help support the top case. I want to show you some more joints on the prototype. The draw divider meets the apron with a dovetail joint, as well as the mid-rail, and the mid-rail meets the leg with a dovetail joint. I'll make those with my router. Now that's the dovetail in the legs. I've clamped both legs together, and I've used the straight edge with my dovetailing bit. Here I've set up the piece for the apron and the mid-rail bottom side up so that I'll be assured that those dovetail sockets will align. I've set up the straight edge, and I'm going to use the same bit to cut the socket. Now, using the router and a guide fence, I'm making some small rabbets that are going to receive the draw supports and runners. And I'll just square up the corners with a sharp chisel. Now here I have the back panel of the base inside facing up, and I'm routing pockets to pick up the back end of those draw supports. Here's a pattern of the scroll work that I took from the original. This is for the apron, and these small ones are for the end panels. In spite of all those machines we have, I need to do a little bit of handwork with a nice sharp chisel to get into those corners. For the last hour, I've been dry fitting the piece together. I've had to make some fine adjustments to the mortise and tenon joints. There's no glue at this point. I just want to make sure that the joints are nice and tight and that the pieces are even where I want them to be. And everything's fitting well so far. I've also taken that mid-rail and cut it to length now so that it goes from the bottom of that dovetail that I machined earlier. And I've made a sample of the dovetail. Here's the piece right here. I want that to slide in nice and tight. So now that that's set, I can machine the dovetail on each end of that rail. Now let me show you the setup. I've installed the same router bit in the router table that I used to make the slots. I've installed this tall backer board, and I want to make sure that that is perpendicular to the table. Otherwise, the dovetail isn't going to fit properly. It also gives me a big surface against which I can run the piece. I like to pick a piece of scrap and put it behind the piece as I run it through so I don't get any tear out. Perfect. Okay, that's going to be good. Now I'm going to take this piece of tiger maple and form a dovetail on each end, then slice out 2 dividers for that center draw. Well, that takes care of the dry fit. Before I leave tonight, I think I'll glue it up, and tomorrow we'll start working on the uppercase. Well, as promised, I did complete the glue up of the base. And this morning I'm getting started making a frame which will go on top of that base. It's held together with biscuits and glue. You'll note that I've notched the corners to account for the legs. Well, now's the time for the draw supports to go in. It's poplar, rabbited on each edge. The back is dry, no glue. Just glue the front and slip it in the notches I made earlier. Now this little strip will guide the sides of the drawers. The support that goes along the side is notched to fit around the legs. Now the side guide. And I just use a piece of scrap to line it up with the inside of the legs. There are 3 supports at the mid-rail. All right, our frame is set up enough. It slips into the rabbets I made in the panels earlier with a little glue. I'll put some brads and clamps as necessary. Now I want to start assembling the uppercase. It's made up of 4 boards. There's one right above this drawer, one at the bottom, both made out of poplar, and the sides are tiger maple. They're glue-ups that I made earlier. I've sized them correctly, and I want to join the corners of those panels with through dovetails. So I've set up my dovetailing jig with the spacing that I want. I want to cut the tails first, so here's one of the tail boards. I'm going to use my router, which is set up with a collar and a dovetailing bit. And it's very important that I run that collar into these slots to form the tails, and I want to remove the material on each end. All right, that takes care of the dovetails. Now we'll machine the pins in the tiger maple. Well, now I'm set up to make some pins. I have one of the side panels in place, the tiger maple, the outside facing away from the jig. I've flipped the fingers over, and I've changed my router bit. I now have a straight cutting bit in there. And what I want to do is remove all the material between each set of fingers. All right, let's check the fit of those pins. Yeah, that's just a little bit too snug, but I can adjust my jig to take just a little bit more off. Now, it's not going to take much, just a hair. All right, let's see if that did it. Yeah, I think that's going to be fine. Now, if you check out this case, you'll note that there is a rail between each drawer out of tiger maple that's dovetailed into the side. There's a poplar rail at the back which is also dovetailed into the side, and in between there's a drawer runner which sits in a very shallow dado. This rabbet at the back edge of the side panels is where the backboards will be fitted in, and it conceals the ends. Now I'm ready to start those dovetails, and here's a sample of what I'm trying to do. The dovetail is centered in the slot that I made earlier, and it's about 1.5 inches long. Now I have 16 of those to make, so I decided to make a jig, and we'll give you the dimensions for this in the plan. It's a platform on which I've put this stick, which sticks down a bit so that it can slide into that dado. There's a stop, which limits its movement in the direction that I'm going to be pushing the router. Now I clamp it in place with a couple spring clamps, and I've set up the router with a dovetailing bit and a collar. Now the cleats on each side of the router will limit its movement left and right, and the collar will stop here, controlling the length of the cut. Here you can see that I've reassembled the box. I've put the dovetail joints together. It's dry fit, no glue yet, so that I can do some additional layout. I'm going to take a piece of 3/4 inch stock and hold it flush with the maple and put a mark on the back side, because my scroll board is going to be 3/4 of an inch thick, and I need to remove this material so it can slip by. I've also marked out for a groove into which the scroll board will fit. Now at the back, I also have to remove some material. I'll take the same scrap, slide it into the rabbet, bring it up to my panel, and put a mark, because I want the backboards to go by. And the same thing is true here at the bottom. Now I'll just cut to those marks. Let me show you the router setup to cut the groove for the scroll board. I have a guide fence and a 1/4 inch spiral bit. Just guide it along the edge and we'll have a slot. Well, now I'm ready to glue the case together. I'm going to apply glue to all those dovetail surfaces that meet each other. It takes a while. I'm using a glue that has a longer open assembly time, so it won't set before I actually get it clamped. All right, now I've got the top corners all glued up. We'll get this together and clamp the whole thing. Well, here's where that dry fit pays off. You know it's going to fit. For the last several minutes, I've been making a test piece of that dovetail that has to fit into these sockets. And I'm satisfied with the fit now, so I can run some pieces through the router table. Now, I don't need a tenon along the entire width of each piece. I only need about half of it, so I'll remove the excess at the bandsaw. There'll be draw runners that fit between the front and back rails. I'm going to have to form tenons on those runners that are going to fit into mortises that I'll make in the rails. We'll make the mortises first. I've installed a 1/4-inch spiral cutting bit in the router table, and I've put some indicator marks on the fence where I want to plunge in. You can see just below the tenon, I'll plunge in there, and then I'll run to this line. Then I'll flip it end for end and do the same thing on the other end. Now, here are the pieces for the runners. I'll rotate them through the dado on each end, forming the tenon. In order to get this square tenon to fit into the rounded ends of that mortise, you need to knock off the corners. That's easily done with this utility knife. Okay, that's good. Now we're ready to assemble the various pieces. I've put glue on the dovetail tenons and in the slot, and I'll just drive this in place so it's flush with the front. Another advantage of this dovetail joint is that because of its shape, it actually holds the case together. And I got to say, it looks good. Now for the runners, I glue the tenon into the mortise that I made in those front rails. Now the only difference with the back rail is that I didn't apply glue to the tenon of the runner, because I want it to float. You'll note there's a gap of 1/8 of an inch. That'll let the side expand and contract freely. Now this piece of tiger maple down here that goes along the bottom is purely for aesthetics. A little bit of glue and brads will hold it in place, and it's just a butt joint. And there are a couple draw runners, one on each end. Notice that I've left a gap. No glue, just a few brads. Now on the top frame only, there are 2 intermediate runners that help support the top 3 draws, and they're installed just like the ones on the ends. Well, mission accomplished. We've built the upper case and the lower case for our Highboy. Now next time, we'll work on this scroll board, the bonnet top, including these S moldings. I'll make this pendant and some finials, of course a whole set of drawers, and I'll carve out these faux fods on the center drawers and we'll apply a finish. Well, the first thing I want to take care of today are the brackets which I have to attach to these legs. I've just cut out the shape, the rough shape of the bracket, and now I'm going to trace the curve of the knee of the leg. I'll sand this out and then I'll cut off the excess. A little bit of glue and I'll clamp it in place. Once the glue's cured, I'll sand it flush. Let's take a look at the scroll board, which is this piece right here. The ends have tenons that fit into the grooves I made in the side panels. I need to remove material in the middle to receive the center draw. And there are 2 dividers which are dovetailed into the rail and into the scroll board. And that takes care of the tenon on the ends. Now, the worst case scenario is that I cut this piece too short. So I'm going to slide it into the tenon on the left-hand side, and I've just made a little nick with the dado on the right-hand side, and that looks pretty good, so we'll run it through. This little notch in the tenon will conceal the mortise. With the scroll board set in place on these spacer blocks, which gives me the opening for the small drawer, I've laid out the opening for the large drawer as well as those dividers. Let me show you the setup for making the vertical cuts because I don't want to mess this up. I've raised my blade higher than I normally would for a piece of 3/4 inch stock because I want to make as much of the cut as possible with the saw blade. Now, I also don't want to overcut, so I've transferred a line at the leading edge of the blade over to my fence. I have a stop line on the end of my piece. When these two line up, that's when I stop. For the rip cut, I've set up a straight edge guide, and I'm going to use my small circular saw to make the cut. Now my little Japanese saw finishes off the corner. To make the divider, which is going to go between the drawers, I'm going to start out with a piece of 7/8 inch stock that's much wider than I need, form a dovetail on each end where necessary, and then rip the pieces out 3/4 of an inch thick. And that's what I need. And you need to mark something very precisely. You mark it with a knife. Now, there's no easier way to do this than with a good sharp chisel. Now I can lay out the scroll board using a full-scale pattern. This is the back of the bonnet. It's 1/2 inch poplar, a couple boards glued together. It fits between the rabbets at the back of the case. And if you look at the bottom, I have a groove, and that's going to receive the tongue from the boards that will complete the back. The profile of this piece is the same as the scroll board. The back of the bonnet is enclosed, so all I really need to do is take the scroll board and trace the outer curves. Well, let's take another look at the prototype, and I want to talk about this scroll board and pediment. On the antique original, the scroll board and this pediment were all out of one wide board. Now, I couldn't get a board that wide. I had to glue up a piece, and there's a seam right here. Now, if that seam was carried across through this pediment, it wouldn't be very attractive. So what I've done is made the pediment an independent piece from this point up. Now below this, right now I only have 3/4 of an inch of stock, and that's very weak. So I want to thicken this up by adding another piece of material behind it. Now here I've clamped a piece of 3/4 inch stock to the back of the scroll board, and I'm tracing the outline. Now when I cut it, I'm going to cut a 1/16 of an inch outside of the line. A little bit of glue and some brads will secure this piece. Now, if you look at the top of the bonnet, you see that it's covered. It sort of has a roof on it. It's made up of 1/8 inch thick poplar. Now, often on the antiques, you see cracks across these because it's very thin. Now, in a woodworking magazine I read recently, I found a tip, and that was to laminate the back of that thin poplar with a piece of artist canvas. Now, I'm using a contact cement. I've put one coat on. I want to put another one on. And once it's tacky, I'll apply the canvas to the poplar. Now at this point I'm ready to trim that block that I glue behind the scroll board. To do that I'm going to use my router with a pattern making bit. It has a ball bearing. The ball bearing will ride on this outer cut and trim away the excess of the block. Using my spacer blocks, I'm going to put these guides or cleats along each side of the case, and these are going to help keep that small top drawer from tipping down as it's opened. No glue, just screws. Now for some guides for the side of both the end drawers and the center one. I can use glue here, and I'll secure them with some brads. All right, now we're ready to install the scroll board. Set my little gauge blocks in place, and we'll just slide it down into position and put one clamp across the front. Well, now I'm ready for these dovetailed dividers, and we'll set it in place. Now, I want to make a better connection between this divider and this section of the scroll board, so I'm going to use a dowel. And this is a stepped dowel. I have a drill bit that's also stepped. I simply drill the hole and then glue the dowel in. Now, the manufacturer claims that this is much stronger than an ordinary dowel and that it requires no clamping once it's driven in. Now, after multiple coats of the contact adhesive and letting it dry until it's just tacky, I'm ready to bring the pieces together. I'm going to lay the wood on top of the cloth, flip it back over again, and then take this J-roller and roll from the center out to make sure I get a good bond and remove any air bubbles. Here I've laid out the location of the vertical partitions, and this first cleat I'm going to put on will hold the bottom edge. It's screwed in place, no glue, and I've left a little gap at the front and back for expansion. Now here's one of the vertical partitions, and I need to remove this material above the face of the scroll board. It's a curve. I'll cut most of it off at the table saw, which will be set at a bevel, and then I'll plane it smooth with the top of the scroll board. I apply a little glue to the back of the scroll board where the partition's going to meet it and along the edge of the cleat. And set it in place, and I will brad it I don't want to drive any nails through the face of the scroll board, so I'm just going to put a glue block on the back side and brad that in place. Now this is the back, and I've put a line which represents the top of the case. And I'm going to nail these glue blocks on first. And now I can take the back, set it in place with those blocks right on the top, and nail it into the back of the case with some brads. One more glue block back here where the partition meets the back. Now's a good time to plane off the top of that partition. Well, now it's time to make up the rest of the boards for the back. I have this 1/2-inch poplar. First thing I'm going to do is make a groove by making 2 passes through the table saw. Now here's the setup for making the tongues. A stacked dado, a sacrificial fence, and a feather board to hold the stock tight to the table. A pass on each face will form a tongue. So with the pieces cut to length, it's just a matter of driving them in place and securing them with some brads. Well, I'd say we made some good progress today. Tomorrow we'll make some moldings, make some drawers, and do a little bit of carving. I think we'll be able to finish this project. Oh, good morning. I'm getting started today working on a detail at the center of the bonnet. I'm installing these little blocks which create a return for our molding. Cut out of the maple, and I actually machine that little cove in the bottom first. And now I'm just using some glue and brads to secure it in place. All right, now it's time to put the roof on the bonnet. Now this is the panel that I glued up yesterday, the 1/8-inch poplar with the canvas backing, and hopefully that will prevent this panel from cracking as the piece ages. To secure it in place, I've centered it. There's a little extra I'll trim off later, and I'm using these 3/4-inch wire nails. All right, that takes care of this concave surface. Now to bend it over the top, when I built the prototype, the first piece split. So I found that by spraying it with water, it'll help soften the wood and make it easier to curve it down. Well, that looks pretty good, and as you can see, it almost conforms to the shape by itself. Now I can complete nailing it off. I want to start working on the moldings. There's a straight piece here, an S piece, and another little return. I'm going to start with the S-shaped piece. So I have a piece of stock 1.5 inches thick and about 8 inches wide. This is a template that I made. It's a little bit longer than what I'm going to need, and I want to trace that out first. Now in sequence, I want to clip the ends. Now I've just cut the bottom of our S molding. I'm going to sand that smooth. I won't bother with the top now. Now here's a profile of the molding. And I'm just going to trace it on the end as a guide. The S molding is the most difficult piece to make on this project, and a lot of the work has been done by hand. I made this sketch to show you what I'm trying to do. Here's a cross-section of the molding, about double scale. By using a series of router bits in my router table, I can remove a lot of the material. I'll start here. A couple passes with a 3/4 inch rabbiting bit will take this material out. Then I'll switch over to my classic bit to give me this cove and half of this bead. Then back to the rabbiting bit to remove this material right here. Then a panel cutter will give me part of this curve, just staying above the bead again. And finally, a slot cutting bit will clean out some of this material. The rest is done by hand. Because this is a curved piece, I've got to remove the fence. But I must install this start pin. The work has to be against the pin as I start to bring it into the bit. And I try to keep it in contact as much as possible. Now I've switched to what router manufacturers refer to as a classic bit. I'll make 2 passes, one to rough it, one to sweeten it. I've reinstalled the rabbiting bit and will remove some more material. This time that bearing is going to ride up against this step. Now I've switched to the panel raising bit, and here the ball bearing is going to ride on that little shoulder right next to the bead. Now I've switched to a slot cutting bit to remove a little more material. Now using a small cove bit, I've removed about all the material that I can get with a router. Here's the blank for the straight molding, a lot wider than what I need. I'm going to use the table saw blade and raise it to different heights and move the fence to nibble away the material from this shoulder to the bead. Now I'm going to turn to my router table and I want to knock off that little corner with this veining bit. Now I've switched back to my classic bit. I've also made a little rabbet in my blank so that it won't hit the shank of the bit. Now for the straight pieces of molding, it's all about sanding. I start out with 36 grit, move to 80, then to 120, down to 150. It takes a while. Well, now we're starting in on our S molding, and the first thing that I do is take this little V-groove carving tool and establish the back edge of that bead. Now I've switched to a larger V-groove carving tool to carve down a little bit deeper. Well, now I've switched to a gouge to remove the material behind that bead. It's always easier to carve against the grain, but with this S shape, there's going to be times that I have to go with the grain. I have to be very careful when I do that I don't tear it out. Now I want to round over this corner. And that's easily done with a good sharp chisel. Now, just as with the straight pieces, I'll start with the coarse sandpaper, in this case 80, and keep sanding until everything's smooth in the way I want it. And this is what it should look like after several sanding steps. Now I can cut it to width on the bandsaw. Well, now I want to trim off the roof and sand it flush. Well, now I'm ready to fit the moldings. I've clamped the S molding in place, flush with the poplar, and now I'm just going to mark the back of the miter. Now this piece of scrap MDF with a perfectly square corner is going to help me hold the piece as I make the miter at the miter box. Well, now we'll nail it on and put a little glue on those mitered corners. Well, after fussing around with the bonnet molding, this is what it should look like. It's fussy work, but it's important because this is where the eye is going to go when you look at the piece. Now, that's not an optical illusion. I made all the drawers but one earlier. They're different sizes, but the construction methods are all the same. Let me show you. It starts with the drawer front. Using my stacked dado, I'll make a rabbet on 3 sides. Using my dovetailing jig, I've just cut the half-blind dovetails where the side piece will meet the front. That takes care of the pins in the drawer front. Well, now I've switched my dovetail jig into the through dovetail mode, and I've just made the tails where the side will meet the back. And that takes care of the pins in the back. All 4 sides of the drawer need a groove for the plywood bottom. 2 passes through the saw take care of that. All the edges of all the drawers get this bead detail. Now, before I can assemble this drawer, I have to carve the drawer front. Here's a full-size pattern of the filfard I took from the antique, and using a series of carving tools, I'll carve out the drawer front. Now, after about an hour of carving, this is what it should look like. And using varying grits of sandpaper, I can refine it until it's smooth. Well, now I'm ready for some assembly. Glue on all the mating surfaces, and we'll just tap it together. Now the bottom goes in place, no glue, and then I'll slip the through dovetails together and put on a couple clamps. Now for the pendant. Cut out of a solid piece of maple. I carve the filfard on the other side, just like I did with the drawer, except that it's smaller. A 1/2-inch hole in the top will receive the finial, and on the bottom I've already drilled a 7/16 hole for a dowel, which will allow me to attach it to the scroll board. And I'll drill out that using my jig. Okay, that's nice and tight. After the glue dries, a little bit of sanding to even it up and make a little relief in the face of the scroll board. This profile is for the molding that wraps around the base of the top cabinet. This molding just dresses up this intersection, installed with glue and brads. Here I'm turning my finials out of another piece of tiger maple, and I might as well do 2 at once. I want to make sure that these holes are nice and plumb. The center finial has this little detail piece that is glued in place. The finial gets no glue, just set in the hole that I drilled. Now that the woodworking is done, this piece is ready for the finishing room. For the finish on our Highboy, I started out by raising the grain with some distilled water. And after it dried, I took some steel wool, knocked it down a little bit. Then I mixed up some stain, two different stains, honey tone and golden amber, and then applied that. Once that dried, I hit it once again with the steel wool. And now I'm applying a coat of shellac. Once the shellac dries, I'll hit it again very lightly with the steel wool, and then we'll be ready for some glaze. The next step in the finishing process is to apply a glaze. And the difference between a glaze and a stain is that a glaze sits on the surface because we've already sealed the wood with the shellac. The other advantage to a glaze is that if there's any difference in the color of the wood, or wood such as this tiger maple, it'll bring out the highlights and I can control it to get a nice even color. After the glaze dried, I applied another coat of shellac and then several coats of wipe-on polyurethane. And I'm really pleased the way this finish turned out. The color is just right and the tiger of the maple is really popping out. Now the hardware, that's special. It's a copy of the one we saw on the antique original, manufactured by a craftsman down in Pennsylvania who specializes in period hardware. They already look like they're 100 years old. Well, there it is, our bonnet-topped Highboy, ready for 200 years of gentle use by a loving family. I was really happy that I built this project. I hope you'll build one too. You can do it.
If you've enjoyed this new Yankee project, you may want to try some of the others. There are projects meant for the workshop, the garden, the kitchen, and many more. So whether you're a fan of Shaker style, or colonial, arts and crafts, or Chippendale, there may be a Norm project you'd like to build. Whether it's a clock or a gazebo, a picnic bench or a Windsor chair, a child's toy or a sailboat, visit the New Yankee website at www.newyankee.com for a complete listing.